the new god of paradise, the new gods of paradise, the new god of paradise, the new goddess of paradise, the new goddesses of paradise, the new goddess of paradise, the old god of paradise, the old gods of paradise, the old god of paradise, the old goddess of paradise, the old goddesses of paradise, the old goddess of paradise, the greater god of paradise, the greater gods of paradise, the greater god of paradise, the greater goddess of paradise, the greater goddesses of paradise, the greater goddess of paradise, the lesser god of paradise, the lesser gods of paradise, the lesser god of paradise, the lesser goddess of paradise, the lesser goddesses of paradise, the lesser goddess of paradise, the higher god of paradise, the higher gods of paradise, the higher god of paradise, the higher goddess of paradise, the higher goddesses of paradise, the higher goddess of paradise, the lower god of paradise, the lower gods of paradise, the lower god of paradise, the lower goddess of paradise, the lower goddesses of paradise, the lower goddess of paradise, the greater spirit of paradise, the greater spirits of paradise, the greater spirit of paradise, the lesser spirit of paradise, the lesser spirits of paradise, the lesser spirit of paradise, the higher spirit of paradise, the higher spirits of paradise, the higher spirit of paradise, the lower spirit of paradise, the lower spirits of paradise, the lower spirit of paradise, the major god of paradise, the major gods of paradise, the major god of paradise, the major goddess of paradise, the major goddesses of paradise, the major goddess of paradise, the minor god of paradise, the minor gods of paradise, the minor god of paradise, the minor goddess of paradise, the minor goddesses of paradise, the minor goddess of paradise, the superior god of paradise, the superior gods of paradise, the superior god of paradise, the superior goddess of paradise, the superior goddesses of paradise, the superior goddess of paradise, the inferior god of paradise, the inferior gods of paradise, the inferior god of paradise, the inferior goddess of paradise, the inferior goddesses of paradise, the inferior goddess of paradise, the ancestor god of paradise, the ancestor gods of paradise, the ancestor god of paradise, the ancestor goddess of paradise, the ancestor goddesses of paradise, the ancestor goddess of paradise, the ascendant god of paradise, the ascendant gods of paradise, the ascendant god of paradise, the ascendant goddess of paradise, the ascendant goddesses of paradise, the ascendant goddess of paradise, the descendant god of paradise, the descendant gods of paradise, the descendant god of paradise, the descendant goddess of paradise, the descendant goddesses of paradise, the descendant goddess of paradise, the transcendent god of paradise, the transcendent gods of paradise, the transcendent god of paradise, the transcendent goddess of paradise, the transcendent goddesses of paradise, the transcendent goddess of paradise, the past god of paradise, the past gods of paradise, the past god of paradise, the past goddess of paradise, the past goddesses of paradise, the past goddess of paradise, the present god of paradise, the present gods of paradise, the present god of paradise, the present goddess of paradise, the present goddesses of paradise, the present goddess of paradise, the future god of paradise, the future gods of paradise, the future god of paradise, the future goddess of paradise, the future goddesses of paradise, the future goddess of paradise, the authentic god of paradise, the authentic gods of paradise, the authentic god of paradise, the authentic goddess of paradise, the authentic goddesses of paradise, the authentic goddess of paradise, the synthetic god of paradise, the synthetic gods of paradise, the synthetic god of paradise, the synthetic goddess of paradise, The synthetic goddesses of paradise. The synthetic goddess of paradise. The progressive god of paradise. The progressive gods of paradise. The progressive god of paradise. The progressive goddess of paradise. The progressive goddesses of paradise. The progressive goddess of paradise. The regressive god of paradise. The regressive gods of paradise. The regressive god of paradise. The regressive goddess of paradise. The regressive goddesses of paradise. The regressive goddess of paradise. The ordinary god of paradise. The ordinary gods of paradise. The ordinary god of paradise. The ordinary goddess of paradise. The ordinary goddesses of paradise. The ordinary goddess of paradise. The extraordinary god of paradise. The extraordinary gods of paradise. The extraordinary god of paradise. The extraordinary goddess of paradise. The extraordinary goddesses of paradise. The extraordinary goddess of paradise. The static god of paradise. The static gods of paradise. The static god of paradise. The static goddess of paradise. The static goddesses of paradise. The static goddess of paradise. The dynamic god of paradise. The dynamic gods of paradise. The dynamic god of paradise. The dynamic goddess of paradise. The dynamic goddesses of paradise. The dynamic goddess of paradise. The land god of paradise. The land gods of paradise. The land god of paradise. The land goddess of paradise. The land goddesses of paradise. The land goddess of paradise. The sea god of paradise. The sea gods of paradise. The sea god of paradise. The sea goddess of paradise. The sea goddesses of paradise. The sea goddess of paradise. The sky god of paradise. The sky gods of paradise. The sky god of paradise. The sky goddess of paradise. The sky goddesses of paradise. The sky goddess of paradise. The god of paradise. The gods of paradise. The god of paradise. The goddess of paradise. The goddesses of paradise. The goddess of paradise. The half god of paradise. The half gods of paradise. The half god of paradise. The half goddess of paradise. The half goddesses of paradise. The half goddess of paradise. The vessel of paradise. The vessels of paradise. The vessel of paradise. The name of paradise. The names of paradise. The name of paradise. The person of paradise. The persons of paradise. The person of paradise. The persona of paradise. The personas of paradise. The persona of paradise. The personage of paradise. The personages of paradise. The personage of paradise. The personality of paradise. The personalities of paradise. The personality of paradise. The personification of paradise. The personifications of paradise. The personification of paradise. The image of paradise. The images of paradise. The image of paradise. The imagination of paradise. The imaginations of paradise. The imagination of paradise. The belief of paradise. The beliefs of paradise. The belief of paradise. The thought of paradise. The thoughts of paradise. The thought of paradise. The word of paradise. The words of paradise. The word of paradise. The action of paradise. The actions of paradise. The action of paradise. The reaction of paradise. The reactions of paradise. The reaction of paradise. The feeling of paradise. The feelings of paradise. The feeling of paradise. The situation of paradise. The situations of paradise. The situation of paradise. The circumstance of paradise. The circumstances of paradise. The circumstance of paradise. The environment of paradise. The environments of paradise. The environment of paradise. The relationship of paradise. The relationships of paradise. The relationship of paradise. The number of paradise. The numbers of paradise. The number of paradise. The formula of paradise. The formulas of paradise. The formula of paradise. The equation of paradise. The equations of paradise. The equation of paradise. The theory of paradise. The theories of paradise. The theory of paradise. The symbol of paradise. The symbols of paradise. The symbol of paradise. The color of paradise. The colors of paradise. The color of paradise. The thing of paradise. The things of paradise. The thing of paradise. The way of paradise. The ways of paradise. The way of paradise. The place of paradise. The places of paradise. The place of paradise. The time of paradise. The times of paradise. The time of paradise. The event of paradise. The events of paradise. The event of paradise. The result of paradise. The results of paradise. The result of paradise. The crown of paradise. The crowns of paradise. The crown of paradise. The throne of paradise. The thrones of paradise. The throne of paradise. The paradise king. The paradise kings. The paradise kingdom. The paradise kingdoms. The paradise king's subject. The paradise king's subjects. The paradise king's dominion. The paradise king's dominions. The kingdom of paradise. The kingdoms of paradise. The kingdom of paradise. The paradise queen. The paradise queens. The paradise queendom. The paradise queendoms. The paradise queen's subject. The paradise queen's subjects. The paradise queen's dominion. The paradise queen's dominions. The queendom of paradise. The queendoms of paradise. The queendom of paradise. The paradise prince. The paradise princes. The paradise princedom. The paradise princedoms. The paradise prince's subject. The paradise prince's subjects. The paradise prince's dominion. The paradise prince's dominions. The princedom of paradise. The princedoms of paradise. The princedom of paradise. The paradise princess. The paradise princesses. The paradise princessdom. The paradise princessdoms. The paradise princess's subject. The paradise princess's subjects. The paradise princess's dominion. The paradise princess's dominions. The princessdom of paradise. The princessdoms of paradise. The princessdom of paradise. The Lord of paradise. The lords of paradise. The Lord of paradise. The lordess of paradise. The lordesses of paradise. The lordess of paradise. The priest of paradise. The priests of paradise. The priest of paradise. The priestess of paradise. The priestesses of paradise. The priestess of paradise. The ritual of paradise. The rituals of paradise. The ritual of paradise. The shrine of paradise. The shrines of paradise. The shrine of paradise. The temple of paradise. The temples of paradise. The temple of paradise. The leader of paradise. The leaders of paradise. The leader of paradise. The follower of paradise. The followers of paradise. The follower of paradise. The natural substance of paradise. The natural substances of paradise. The natural substance of paradise. The supernatural substance of paradise. The supernatural substances of paradise. The supernatural substance of paradise. The temporal substance of paradise. The temporal substances of paradise. The temporal substance of paradise. The spiritual substance of paradise. The spiritual substances of paradise. The spiritual substance of paradise. The natural form of paradise. The natural forms of paradise. The natural form of paradise. The supernatural form of paradise. The supernatural forms of paradise. The supernatural form of paradise. The temporal form of paradise. The temporal forms of paradise. The temporal form of paradise. The spiritual form of paradise. The spiritual forms of paradise. The spiritual form of paradise. The age of paradise. The ages of paradise. The age of paradise. The era of paradise. The heiress of paradise. The era of paradise. The awakener of paradise. The awakeners of paradise. The awakener of paradise. The awakening of paradise. The awakenings of paradise. The awakening of paradise. The realm of paradise. The realms of paradise. The realm of paradise. The dimension of paradise. The dimensions of paradise. The dimension of paradise. The zone of paradise. The zones of paradise. The zone of paradise. The frequency of paradise. The frequencies of paradise. The frequency of paradise. The century of paradise. The centuries of paradise. The century of paradise. The millennium of paradise. The millenniums of paradise. The millennium of paradise. The purpose of paradise. The purposes of paradise. The purpose of paradise. The meaning of paradise. The meanings of paradise. The meaning of paradise. The culture of paradise. The cultures of paradise. The culture of paradise. The demonstrator of paradise. The demonstrators of paradise. The demonstrator of paradise. The demonstration of paradise. The demonstrations of paradise. The demonstration of paradise. The manifester of paradise. The manifestors of paradise. The manifester of paradise. The manifestation of paradise. The manifestations of paradise. The manifestation of paradise. The presence of paradise. The presences of paradise. The presence of paradise. The glow of paradise. The glows of paradise. The glow of paradise. The goal of paradise. The goals of paradise. The goal of paradise. The plan of paradise. The plans of paradise. The plan of paradise. The book of paradise. The books of paradise. The book of paradise. The philosopher of paradise. The philosophers of paradise. The philosopher of paradise. The philosophy of paradise. The philosophies of paradise. The philosophy of paradise. The releaser of paradise. The releasers of paradise. The releaser of paradise. The release of paradise. The releases of paradise. The release of paradise. The variable of paradise. The variables of paradise. The variable of paradise. The cause of paradise. The causes of paradise. The cause of paradise. The effect of paradise. The effects of paradise. The effect of paradise. The journey of paradise. The journeys of paradise. The journey of paradise. The emergence of paradise. The emergences of paradise. The emergence of paradise. The source of paradise. The sources of paradise. The source of paradise. The originator of paradise. The originators of paradise. The originator of paradise. The origin of paradise. The origins of paradise. The origin of paradise. The forefather of paradise. The forefathers of paradise. The forefather of paradise. The foremother of paradise. The foremothers of paradise. The foremother of paradise. The ancestor of paradise. The ancestors of paradise. The ancestor of paradise. The descendant of paradise. The descendants of paradise. The descendant of paradise. The lineage of paradise. The lineages of paradise. The lineage of paradise. The heritage of paradise. The heritages of paradise. The heritage of paradise. The heir of paradise. The heirs of paradise. The heir of paradise. The co-heir of paradise. The co-heirs of paradise. The co-heir of paradise. The joint heir of paradise. The joint heirs of paradise. The joint heir of paradise. The dynasty of paradise. The dynasties of paradise. The dynasty of paradise. The force of paradise. The forces of paradise. The force of paradise. The law of paradise. The laws of paradise. The law of paradise. The pact of paradise. The pacts of paradise. The pact of paradise. The game of paradise. The games of paradise. The game of paradise. The mask of paradise. The masks of paradise. The mask of paradise. The armor of paradise. The armors of paradise. The armor of paradise. The sword of paradise. The swords of paradise. The sword of paradise. The shield of paradise. The shields of paradise. the shield of paradise, the force shield of paradise, the force shields of paradise, the force shield of paradise, the armored force shield of paradise, the armored force shields of paradise, the armored force shield of paradise, the champion of paradise, the champions of paradise, the champion of paradise, the guardian of paradise, the guardians of paradise, the guardian of paradise, the defender of paradise, the defenders of paradise, the defender of paradise, the protector of paradise, the protectors of paradise, the protector of paradise, the chant of paradise, the chants of paradise, the chant of paradise, the shape of paradise, the shapes of paradise, the shape of paradise, the cube of paradise, the cubes of paradise, the cube of paradise, the cuboid of paradise, the cuboids of paradise, the cuboid of paradise, the sphere of paradise, the spheres of paradise, the sphere of paradise, the spheroid of paradise, the spheroids of paradise, the spheroid of paradise, the prism of paradise, the prisms of paradise, the prism of paradise, the pyramid of paradise, the pyramids of paradise, the pyramid of paradise, the cylinder of paradise, the cylinders of paradise, the cylinder of paradise, the cone of paradise, the cones of paradise, the cone of paradise, the triangle of paradise, the triangles of paradise, the triangle of paradise, the circle of paradise, the circles of paradise, the circle of paradise, the semicircle of paradise, the semicircles of paradise, the semicircle of paradise, the square of paradise, the squares of paradise, the square of paradise, the rectangle of paradise, the rectangles of paradise, the rectangle of paradise, the parallelogram of paradise, the parallelograms of paradise, the parallelogram of paradise, the rhombus of paradise, the rhombuses of paradise, the rhombus of paradise, the trapezoid of paradise, the trapezoids of paradise, the trapezoid of paradise, the polygon of paradise, the polygons of paradise, the polygon of paradise, the pentagon of paradise, the pentagons of paradise, the pentagon of paradise, the hexagon of paradise, the hexagons of paradise, the hexagon of paradise, the septagon of paradise, the septagons of paradise, the septagon of paradise, the octagon of paradise, the octagons of paradise, the octagon of paradise, the nonagon of paradise, the nonagons of paradise, the nonagon of paradise, the decagon of paradise, the decagons of paradise, the decagon of paradise, the evolution of paradise, the evolutions of paradise, the evolution of paradise, the revolution of paradise, the revolutions of paradise, the revolution of paradise, the elemental art of paradise, the elemental arts of paradise, the elemental art of paradise, the elemental science of paradise, the elemental sciences of paradise, the elemental science of paradise, the elemental principle of paradise, the elemental principles of paradise, the elemental principle of paradise, the elemental technology of paradise, the elemental technologies of paradise, the elemental technology of paradise, the low elemental art of paradise, the low elemental arts of paradise, the low elemental art of paradise, the low elemental science of paradise, the low elemental sciences of paradise, the low elemental science of paradise, the low elemental principle of paradise, the low elemental principles of paradise, the low elemental principle of paradise, the low elemental technology of paradise, the low elemental technologies of paradise, the low elemental technology of paradise, the high elemental art of paradise, the high elemental arts of paradise, the high elemental art of paradise, the high elemental science of paradise, the high elemental sciences of paradise, the high elemental science of paradise, the high elemental principle of paradise, the high elemental principles of paradise, The high elemental principle of paradise. The high elemental technology of paradise. The high elemental technologies of paradise. The high elemental technology of paradise. The agent of paradise. The agents of paradise. The agent of paradise. The agency of paradise. The agencies of paradise. The agency of paradise. The amplifier of paradise. The amplifiers of paradise. The amplifier of paradise. The amplification of paradise. The amplifications of paradise. The amplification of paradise. The enhancer of paradise. The enhancers of paradise. The enhancer of paradise. The enhancement of paradise. The enhancements of paradise. The enhancement of paradise. The magnifier of paradise. The magnifiers of paradise. The magnifier of paradise. The magnification of paradise. The magnifications of paradise. The magnification of paradise. The influencer of paradise. The influencers of paradise. The influencer of paradise. The influence of paradise. The influences of paradise. The influence of paradise. The emanator of paradise. The emanators of paradise. The emanator of paradise. The emanation of paradise. The emanations of paradise. The emanation of paradise. The converger of paradise. The convergers of paradise. The converger of paradise. The convergence of paradise. The convergences of paradise. The convergence of paradise. The aura of paradise. The auras of paradise. The aura of paradise. The impression of paradise. The impressions of paradise. The impression of paradise. The intelligence of paradise. The intelligences of paradise. The intelligence of paradise. The sophistication of paradise. The sophistications of paradise. The sophistication of paradise. The genius of paradise. The geniuses of paradise. The genius of paradise. The polymath of paradise. The polymaths of paradise. The polymath of paradise. The psychic of paradise. The psychics of paradise. The psychic of paradise. The knowledge of paradise. The knowledges of paradise. The knowledge of paradise. The understanding of paradise. The understandings of paradise. The understanding of paradise. The wisdom of paradise. The wisdoms of paradise. The wisdom of paradise. The secret of paradise. The secrets of paradise. The secret of paradise. The mystery of paradise. The mysteries of paradise. The mystery of paradise. The revelation of paradise. The revelations of paradise. The revelation of paradise. The tactic of paradise. The tactics of paradise. The tactic of paradise. The strategy of paradise. The strategies of paradise. The strategy of paradise. The strength of paradise. The strengths of paradise. The strength of paradise. The might of paradise. The mights of paradise. The might of paradise. The power of paradise. The powers of paradise. The power of paradise. The authority of paradise. The authorities of paradise. The authority of paradise. The dominion of paradise. The dominions of paradise. The dominion of paradise. The rhythm of paradise. The rhythms of paradise. The rhythm of paradise. The melody of paradise. The melodies of paradise. The melody of paradise. The music of paradise. The musics of paradise. The music of paradise. The lyric of paradise. The lyrics of paradise. The lyric of paradise. The song of paradise. The songs of paradise. The song of paradise. The dance of paradise. The dances of paradise. The dance of paradise. The spirit of paradise. The spirits of paradise. The spirit of paradise. The soul of paradise. The souls of paradise. The soul of paradise. The body of paradise. The bodies of paradise. The body of paradise. The mark of paradise. The marks of paradise. The mark of paradise. The promise of paradise. The promises of paradise. The promise of paradise. The visionary of paradise. The visionaries of paradise. the visionary of paradise, the vision of paradise, the visions of paradise, the vision of paradise, the picture of paradise, the pictures of paradise, the picture of paradise, the sound of paradise, the sounds of paradise, the sound of paradise, the dung of paradise, the dungs of paradise, the dung of paradise, the language of paradise, the languages of paradise, the language of paradise, the communication of paradise, the communications of paradise, the communication of paradise, the people of paradise, the peoples of paradise, the people of paradise, the society of paradise, the societies of paradise, the society of paradise, the fortress of paradise, the fortresses of paradise, the fortress of paradise, the government of paradise, the governments of paradise, the government of paradise, the city of paradise, the cities of paradise, the city of paradise, the nation of paradise, the nations of paradise, the nation of paradise, the civilization of paradise, the civilizations of paradise, the civilization of paradise, the world of paradise, the worlds of paradise, the world of paradise,